that some people can actually hear me, which is a great thing. So, thank you for sorting that out.
Can everybody hear?
Everybody, the back?
Yeah.
Gary? Now's the time to get it sorted out. Can you hear me at the back? Okay, I'm seeing closer to the mic. Okay? How's that? Is that any better? All right, good. Okay, so is everybody all set here? The people who are going to be speaking in a moment? I would like to welcome everybody to tonight's talk. It's kind of a miserable evening and a fairly grim topic, so I thank you for taking time out to come here. My name's Graham McQueen, and I'm going to be the MC tonight. Before explaining how this event tonight came about, I want to begin with a land acknowledgement, which has become customary for us. I would like to remind us that this event is being held on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations. This land acknowledgement that I am making indicates our awareness of land theft, land misuse, and colonialism, which unfortunately continues to this day in our country. And our land acknowledgement also indicates our respect for the original and ongoing protectors of this land. I want to now say a few words about how tonight's event came about. Exactly 2 weeks ago, Michel Chossudovsky, tonight's speaker, contacted us in Hamilton. Michel said he wished to, quote, initiate a campaign with respect to the threat of nuclear war and North Korea. And he asked us if we had any suggestions. We did. We suggested he come to Hamilton. He's going to be away in Asia in January. He said that he could probably make it in December, so 2 weeks of frantic activity. Here he is, and this is the beginning then of what I hope will become a large campaign. So thank you, Michel, for beginning that and for coming to talk to us so close to the holidays. And thank you to the organizers over the last 2 weeks, especially Ken Stone, who did most of the work. Besides focusing attention on the extremely dangerous crisis with respect to North Korea, the DPRK, there's a wider concern that we have in organizing this forum. The anti-war movement in this country is at best sleeping at the moment. There are many active groups, of course, including the two that are co-sponsoring this event, the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War and Democracy Probe International. But a collection of groups does not make a social movement, and it is the social movement that is, frankly, at a very low ebb at the moment in Canada. Even those of us who think of ourselves as activists often find ourselves reduced to watching presidents and prime ministers parade across the TV. We cross our fingers, hoping for sanity. Should we not be speaking out and taking action now while we still have the opportunity to do so? And so that is one of the broad goals in our minds as we think about a campaign and as we organize tonight's event. Here's the format for tonight's event. Very simple. Our time frame is 7 to 9 p.m. Following a brief introduction, Professor Chossudovsky will speak for about an hour, which should leave us with a good amount of time for questions, answers, and discussion. I've been asked to recognize two VIPs with us tonight, and I'm happy to do so. Mark Teliano, where are you, Mark?
Right here.
Stand up. Thank you. Author of Voices from Syria. And Fred Ernst, researcher, National Security Oversight Institute. Stand up, Fred. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's now my pleasure to ask Ms. Eva Bartlett to introduce our speaker. Many of you will know Eva as an independent freelance journalist who has spent years reporting from the Middle East. She gave a talk in this very church not so long ago on her numerous trips to Syria, and since then she has visited North Korea, the DPRK. Eva, we're honored to have you with us tonight and to introduce our speaker.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming tonight to this very important lecture. I'm honored to be in the position of introducing a giant in the truth media world, Professor Michel Chossudovsky. We are indeed fortunate to have one of the most prolific writers and voices on global events and against imperialist and Zionist machinations and wars. Michel Chossudovsky is an award-winning author, professor of economics, emeritus, at the University of Ottawa, founder and director of the Centre for Research on Globalization in Montreal, and editor of Global Research. He has taught as a visiting professor in Western Europe, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and Latin America. He has served as economic advisor to governments of developing countries and has acted as a consultant for several international organizations. His writings have been published in more than 20 languages. In 2014, he was awarded the Gold Medal for Merit of the Republic of Serbia for his writings on NATO's war of aggression against Yugoslavia. Professor Chossudovsky has long been a lone voice in researching, writing, and speaking truth, being amongst the first and most diligent authors to investigate untouchable subjects, meticulously so. Some of the 11 books he has written include America's War on Terrorism, The Global Economic Crisis, Towards a World War III Scenario, The Dangers of Nuclear War, The Globalization of War, America's Long War Against Humanity. And I'd just like to say that from the Global Research website, it notes Global Research website was established on the 9th of September 2001. During the invasion of Iraq in March and April 2003, Global Research published on a daily basis independent reports from the Middle East, which provided an alternative to the news emanating from embedded journalist reporting from the war theater. And now here I'd like to note that in January I had the honor of sharing a panel with Professor Chossudovsky in Montreal, after which, and we were speaking about Syria, and after which I met a journalist who at the time of the invasion of Iraq was there reporting from Iraq. And he told me, he was at the time working for La Presse in French, and he told me specifically that his very important eyewitness account that he wrote detailing the events of the invasion of Iraq and the sentiments of Iraqi people was edited, cut, it was butchered, and it was rendered into a NATO version of events by his editor at La Presse, who is currently still with La Presse, and her sister is with the Radio Canada. So this is just one example why websites and authors like Global Research and Michel Chossudovsky are so imperative in our world today, imperative sources of truth on global events. I was asked to add a few words regarding my recent trip to the DPRK. In Western corporate media renditions, most news about the country is alarmist. The absurdly cartoonish news one hears in Western media about North Korea is meant to detract from America's past and current crimes against the Korean people, and to garner support for yet another American-led slaughter of innocents. The stories are designed to vilify the leadership and provide no context, while completely ignoring the North Korean perspective. And this is standard with regard to Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, Iraq, Libya, etc., etc., etc. In an August 2017 Forbes essay on North Korea, amid the predictable Western rhetoric were surprising admissions of truths. It read, "Pyongyang looks much more like a normal city than 25 years ago," when the author had visited. Then there were no private cars and few government ones. I wondered why they bothered with traffic lights. Today there is traffic. It's not much by US standards, but it's no longer the ghostly sense of empty boulevards. And it goes on to say, have meaningful encounters with North Korean people, and it's one of the reasons this author of the Forbes essay felt that the US travel ban on North Korea was counterproductive. When I visited, it was coincidentally right before the travel ban was enforced, although as a Canadian citizen that wouldn't impact me. But I visited with two other people, and we were interested in seeing at least a glimpse of the country and at least having some interactions with the people. We were there for 7 days, and what we saw certainly defied what we're told in corporate media. For example, the multi-storied 300-bed children's hospital in Pyongyang, which provides free health care, we saw that it does have modern equipment that were attained at some point when sanctions, I guess, were lifted at some point, but they cannot import any further equipment, let alone medicines or anything related to anything, period. They're under sanctions. And as we know, the sanctions in Iraq led to the deaths of 500,000 children. The sanctions on Syria are hurting the people, not the government. And sanctions everywhere never, ever help the people. It's always intended to hurt them. And that's what it's doing in North Korea. In the teleconsultation department of the Children's Hospital, one older doctor explained, "We have contacts with provincial level and county level hospitals, mostly about children's diseases or illnesses. When they have difficulties with diagnoses, they request consultations from this hospital. I cannot suppress my anger about the sanctions imposed by the US and other countries. Generally, it doesn't affect our health system." This is the North Korean pride coming out, but it does affect their health system. We have a solid health system, and I know that Professor Chossudovsky has written about how even world bodies have recognized that the DPRK's health system is excellent in spite of the sanctions. And we are producing our own medicines. In terms of infrastructure, bearing in mind that North Korea was obliterated in the 50s, what I saw was modern and very impressive, and bearing in mind they've been under sanctions since then. We visited, for example, the transportation system is very inexpensive, and we visited the subway, and it cost like a few cents, and according to one tour group named Yuri Tours, 500,000 people ride the subway daily. And this might explain why there's not so many cars being driven. People are taking public transportation. How much is the bus fare here again? It's a joke. We visited schools, the most moving of which was a middle school, whose students spoke in excellent English about their desire for peace and their desire to share science competitions with students in America and around the world. One teenage boy also said, "We make intercontinental ballistic rockets, not for invading other countries, but for our national defense. To protect one's country, the country must have powerful defense." That's a smart kid. In the hallway of that same school, I saw a poster encouraging students to alert authorities if they came across unexploded ordnance. Our host told me, "We're still discovering old bombs. For example, when we dig to lay the foundation for a building." When later researching, I came across one article noting the discovery of nearly 400 unexploded ordnances near an elementary school playground, and that farmers periodically come across these unexploded ordnances, and that the cleanup period may take longer than 100 years. And this is from the 50s. At the Pyongyang War Museum, I learned there were 400,000 people in Pyongyang, and they dropped more bombs than that on the country. Apparently it was 428,000 bombs. We also visited a children's palace in Pyongyang, a massive structure that provides extracurricular activities, sports, cultural, even science, to students for free, and apparently around 5,000 students attend daily. And just as a side note, I did live in South Korea for 2 years ago after I graduated a debt slave following my university studies. And I remember that if you want to study in extracurricular things in South Korea, parents pay a lot of money to do so. This facility, students could attend for free. We also visited their Science and Technology Center, completed in 2015, which has, it's heated by geothermal energy. It uses solar power. It has over 3,000 computers for, not just for students, but for the general public that attend to use, and also has books in 12 different languages. We did get outside of Pyongyang. We visited an agricultural cooperative, which prior to 2004 was just a mishmash of old farmhouses, but when it was reconstructed, each home on the cooperative, I did have some photos, I'm not sure if they're going to show, but anyway, each home on the farm has its own plot of land. There were many greenhouses, and the houses were modern and clean. And one woman who I spoke with said, prior to this she had been living on the former farm. But she also said, when we asked about the threats of America against the DPRK, she said, although we don't want war, we're not afraid of the US. And indeed, that's something we heard from middle school students, from academics, and from random people we encountered in the amusement park, in the Pyongyang Zoo, and elsewhere. We also heard about their wishes for reunification. with the South, and that their past efforts towards that goal, their desire for peace, but their refusal to be destroyed again. At the DMZ, in a hall near the DMZ, photos depicted meetings in 2000 and 2007 between North and South leaders discussing reunification, and also showed the support of the people for this effort. However, that has not occurred, and I'm sure that Professor Chossudovsky will enlighten us more as to how US meddling has prevented peace on the Korean Peninsula. When returning from the DMZ, stopping at a waterfall park for lunch, I came across a scene I'd seen many times in South Korea. I saw a group of Koreans sitting on the ground, grilling meats, eating kimbap, which is their version of sushi, and drinking soju, which is like sake and beer. And just like in the South, when they saw me, they asked me to come and sit with them and share their food. And these are people that have been vilified. These are people we're told are starving. And these are people that we really have no sense of their humanity. And I have to say that wherever we went, the people we encountered were gracious, were welcoming, were generous. And I think that, this is something our media has completely, intentionally disappeared from the media, so that one has no sense of their humanity. I think that mentioning this human encounter is important, and these other encounters I had with Koreans in the North, for exactly that reason, to again realize their humanity. And when you hear these bombastic news reports in the media about the leader, whatever you think of the leader, please remember that I think it's over 20 million people in North Korea. I can't stress how important Professor Chossudovsky's lecture tonight will be. He brings us a wealth of historical knowledge, not only about the Korean Peninsula, but America's war machinations, what is really behind the nuclear threat the world faces today, and why this is a matter of concern to every person in this room tonight and around the world. Please welcome Professor Michel Chossudovsky.
My thanks to McQueen, to Ken Stone, to everybody here for the opportunity to address some very key issues which are affecting not only the Korean Peninsula, but in fact humanity as a totality. We are at a very dangerous crossroads in our history because the United States and its allies are...
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Michel, what are we doing?
No, that's fine.
Some people were saying they couldn't see the screen because of the lights in front of it.
Okay.
Well, that helps to wash out the image as well, those bright fluorescent tubes.
What? I can see it. Is this all right for the other people? Or?
I think so.
Yeah, that should be better.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we've resolved the technical problem
Okay.
peacefully.
As soon as it shows for the video.
Because I was going to talk about nuclear weapons, so... But mind you, just to put it in perspective, we are at a very dangerous crossroads because the United States, NATO and its allies are waging a global war. This is not a regional war. We can distinguish between several hotspots, and I'll mention them without necessarily elaborating. But we have Eastern Europe and Ukraine, which is a hotspot right at Russia's doorstep. Process of militarization, which is ongoing. We have the Middle East and the the Middle East is an evolving war, and we have the Korean Peninsula. There are other areas of conflict, but these are the three hotspots. And I should say, we have to understand that the United States is not necessarily interested in North Korea. North Korea is a buffer state. It has borders with China and Russia. And the city of Vladivostok is barely about 100 kilometers from the Korean border. I should mention another thing which Donald Trump doesn't address, is that the distance between the capital of South Korea, Seoul, and the demilitarized zone is about the same distance as Manhattan to New Jersey, or from Toronto to Hamilton, but in fact it's shorter. Okay? It takes 45 minutes to get to the demilitarized zone from Seoul, and here you're stuck in traffic. But that's another issue I won't address. But what we must understand is the geography of that region of East Asia. 5 countries: South Korea, North Korea, Russia, China, Japan. And this brings me to the issue of nuclear war and nuclear weapons. In 2001, there was a major shift in nuclear weapons doctrine by the Pentagon, in sharp contrast to our understanding during the Cold War era. The doctrine of the Cold War era was referred to as mutually assured destruction. It was an understanding between Washington and Moscow that they would never use nuclear weapons. It was a weapon of last resort, because this would ultimately lead to the destruction of the planet. Okay? And there are enough nuclear weapons with high yield, explosive capacity, which are capable of blowing up the planet several times. And that is not an understatement. And that's why I'm raising it today. But something very fundamental occurred in 2001-2002, which is contained in a document called the Nuclear Posture Review. Now, the Nuclear Posture Review, first of all, determined a new doctrine, which is the first strike preemptive use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states as well as against enemies of America. Okay? And when they say preemptive, that signifies that you are using nuclear weapons to defend yourself, which is somewhat of an absurd proposition, because nuclear weapons ultimately lead to the destruction of human life. And if we go back to Hiroshima, during the first 7 seconds of the explosion, 100,000 people were dead. And that was a bomb with very low explosive capacity compared to the bombs that we have today, some of which are 1,000 times a Hiroshima bomb. The more sort of average is 100. But then what happened in 2001? Let me get to the redefinition of nuclear weapons in that doctrine. First of all, preemptive nuclear war, first strike. So that means that if a country like North Korea we don't like them, or if we say they're threatening us, which is an absurd proposition, a country which has lost almost 30% of its population during the Korean War, which these figures are acknowledged by the US military. General Curtis LeMay made the statement, we must have killed 20% of the North Korean population and destroyed, there's an important quote, destroyed most of their cities. 98% of the cities were destroyed, okay? And so that, in fact, this country was the object of carpet bombing to such an extent that it lost 30% of its population. There's not a single family in North Korea which hasn't lost a loved one in this war. But bear in mind, with preemptive nuclear attacks to be used on a first strike basis, you have to start to redefine the nature of nuclear weapons. And there you have the notion of so-called tactical nuclear weapons. Now, tactical nuclear weapons are nukes with a lower explosive capacity when compared to the so-called strategic. But they're exactly the same. They simply, instead of being 100 times a Hiroshima bomb, they're 6 to 12 times a Hiroshima bomb. But in fact, the tactical nuclear weapons can go from 1/3 of a Hiroshima bomb to about 6 times a Hiroshima bomb for the so-called B-61-11, and the newer version, it goes up to 12. But what I'm suggesting there is that in using a new concept, which is tactical nuclear weapons, they want to give a human face to this bomb. And in fact, what they did, and they contracted scientists to do that, is to say that these are bunker buster bombs with nuclear warheads, and bunker buster bombs are used to go down into the bunkers of Saddam Hussein. They even said during the Iraq War we should use a bunker buster nuclear bomb against Saddam Hussein because he's down in his bunker. So, but in fact, when you start to look at the military manuals and literature on this, you realize that the bunker buster bomb doesn't go very deep. And then, of course, it explodes and comes out. So it is, and it has a mushroom cloud. So that these mini nukes, as they're called, which is biased concept, have been tagged by scientists on contract to the Pentagon as, and I quote, harmless to the surrounding civilian population because the explosion is underground, unquote. Okay? So that this, and then in 2002, US Senate approves the deployment and use of tactical nuclear weapons in the conventional war theater as part of the toolbox. And it's no longer, God forbid, Donald Trump that actually decides on their use. It might be a 3- or 4-star general in the regional command who can decide and use a tactical nuclear bomb between 1/3 and 6 times a Hiroshima bomb, and they've got tons of them, and they are then categorized as peacemaking bombs. Now, anybody who has a cigarette pack here, anybody smoke here, please identify themselves. If you look at the pack of cigarettes and you see it says smoking can trigger cancer, and imagine what would happen if, say, Minister of Health of Ontario decides to put smoking is good for your health. Well, that's precisely what they've done with the tactical nuclear bomb. They've changed the label of the bomb, and they are now heralding this bomb as a peacemaking instrument, which is harmless to the surrounding civilian population. because explosion is underground. It goes into the military manuals. It is part of disinformation addressed to people who decide. That is why it's so important. And Trump doesn't have the foggiest idea of what a mini-nuke is. But there's another element in this whole discourse, is that in the process of redefining the impacts of tactical nuclear weapons or even strategic nuclear weapons, the issue of radiation is a no-no. None of these bombs that I've mentioned, the B-6111, has any secondary effects in terms of radiation, okay? Even assuming that they hit a military target and there are only a few civilians killed, they deny the fact that this will have radiation, and the radiation spreads in the countries which have been affected by these nuclear attacks. So that in effect, as far as North Korea is concerned, we're talking about 5 countries, and that whole area is subject to radiation, depending on the extent to which these tactical nuclear weapons are used. But mind you, they're already, the issue with Fukushima is already a crisis. But the problem is the following. When we discuss, of course, nuclear annihilation, we're not strictly talking about the process of bombing particular locations. We're talking about the spreading of radiation worldwide. And that ultimately leads to the destruction of humanity. It's not something which occurs immediately. It may occur over 1 or 2 generations. But it is definitely what will occur if nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons are used in the conventional war theater. First of all, the object with regard to North Korea is very clearly stated. It's fire and fury as defined by Trump. But with all due respects to Donald Trump, he didn't invent the concept. It goes back to the Hiroshima Doctrine. It goes back to the Hiroshima Doctrine, where, and it goes back to Harry Truman. As we recall, on the 9th of August 1945, Truman made the following statements. The world will note the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. And that was because we wanted to save the lives of innocent civilians. That is what was, you might call it, that sort of media fake news, right? That was broadcast, it was a radio broadcast that he made while in, I believe he was in Potsdam at the peace negotiations, so on. And then they made a number of other statements. It's in the document. I won't go at length, but what is very important to understand is that the doctrine of using nuclear weapons as a means of destroying countries rather than a weapon of last resort certainly predates this nuclear posture review of 2001. It goes back to World War II, when the United States developed the Manhattan Project. Now, the Manhattan Project started in 1939. That's very important. Now, many Canadians don't know that we were part of the Manhattan Project. It was United States, Canada, and Britain. But Canada played a key role, and also in the sharing of information. I won't go into that. But what I'd like to bring up, and it has to do with the evolution of nuclear doctrine over a certain number of years. But here we have the realities of a country, North Korea, which was literally annihilated through successive bombings in the course of a 3-year period, to the extent that even General MacArthur actually acknowledged the extent of the crimes committed against the North Korean people. 30% of the population wiped out, 98% of the cities. We saw what Pyongyang looked like. Earlier it was a little bit further up, I think. It was completely annihilated. All the cities were destroyed. And then, of course, they've rebuilt. And some of the towers are, on the whole, much better than the Trump towers, okay? With the difference that those towers are social housing, okay? Now, what I would like to do is first make a short interruption and show the first video, which is 5 minutes, and it's an excerpt from a very important documentary, but it shows what the life of Koreans was during the Korean War, where they had to literally defend themselves, and then they went underground, and they had these underground cities, but they still continued with education, of course, defense, and so on. And it's the resilience of this population which has fought for the right to have its own social structure. Now, when people ask me, why is North Korea a target? And people may ask the same question, why is Iran a target? Well, my answer is twofold. First of all, it's a socialist country. And whether we like it or not, it departs from the norms of international capitalism, which increasingly now become imposed on countries, even on allies. So it's the neoliberal, neoconservative agenda. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, North Korea is a stepping stone to Russia and China. And that's also true with regard to Iran. It's interesting that if you go back a few years, and I've documented in my 2011 book, back in 2007, the United States waged. They do this every year, but it's only occasionally that war games, war scenarios are actually leaked. So they have scenarios, and one of the scenarios which was envisaged was called. It was 4 fictitious countries, and I'll mention them: Shuria, Rubeck, Birmingham, and Nemesi. Shuria, China; Rubeck, Russia; Birmingham, Iran; Nemesi, North Korea. And they had a whole timeline of confrontations at the diplomatic level, military level, which ultimately led to World War III. Okay, where these 4 countries are, and these 4 countries are countries which don't abide with the New World Order. Well, with the exception of North Korea, the other 3 are capitalist countries, as far as I'm concerned, China in particular. But that is ultimately what is occurring now. We have a global military agenda, and this is particularly important that we organize forcefully to prevent nuclear war and to prevent war against North Korea. But as I said, a nuclear war is terminal. We'll get back to that after the short video. Do you have the sound on it? Starts at the beginning. Well, I think without the sound doesn't make sense. Can't have the sound at all, or what? So another one in order, or what? But there's no point in showing them, both of them? No?
Yeah, both.
Yeah, okay. We have some technical problems because the sound is not available. And I think without the narrative, it doesn't really make much sense. I suggest you, when you get home, go online and my apologies, but I'll try to maybe give a little bit of a summary, not of the video itself, but of the extent of this fire and fury, which was instigated by under the Truman administration, and General Douglas MacArthur was actually the architect of these war crimes. He, again, he must have had mea culpa, and he testified to the U.S. Congress, and he said, "I have never seen such devastation." The general told members of the Senate Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee, at that time, in May 1951, the Korean War was less than a year old. "I have seen, I guess, as much blood and disaster as any living man," he added, "and I just curdled my stomach," and said he wanted to vomit. Now, that's the man who actually is behind it, so I wouldn't have any sympathy for his statements, but there were divisions between him and Truman. But everything is on record as to the impacts of the US-led war on the people of North Korea. And I quote here, "After destroying North Korea's 78 cities and thousands of her villages and killing countless numbers of her civilians, General Curtis LeMay remarked, quote, 'Over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off what? 20% of the population.' In fact, it was much more than that. But at least they recognize that they committed genocide. Okay, that's the definition of genocide. It's not simply, and so that every single family in North Korea has lost a loved one in the course of the Korean War, and that is part of their, and that history has not been erased. People are fully aware of it. And if you compare to other countries, it is unprecedented in world history. It is unprecedented in world history in comparison, let's say, to the Second World War. Well, some countries were more than others, including Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Germany, of course. But if we look at the figures, we're talking about 0.32% for the United States. Less than 0.5% of their population lost their lives in World War II. And I think that people who I'm talking about the broader public opinion to which we have to reach out, that people should put themselves in the situation of the North Koreans who lost 30% of their population during a three-year-led war. Okay? So what would that signify in a country like the United States or Canada? Who would be considered as a threat to global security, or who is a threat to global security? I think we know who is a threat to global security, and certainly not North Korea. Now, let me just add, before we go on to the next section of the debate. Last year there was a motion at the United Nations General Assembly which was initiated by ICANN, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, which have recently received a Nobel Prize. That motion was adopted by more than 120 countries. Now, the nuclear weapon states which were mentioned in the media reports, the 9 nuclear weapon states, which include the United States, Britain, France, Russia, China, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea. Now, there was only one of those nuclear weapon states that voted in favor of the abolition of nuclear weapons. That was North Korea. And ironically, that was not reported in any single media. If you read, I brought that out, I think, in an earlier article. If you read even the Canadian media, it says the 9 nuclear weapon states voted no. Okay? Canada also voted no, because Canada is sort of a nuclear weapons state from the heyday of the Manhattan Project. But that's another debate. But out of those 9, they said all 9 voted against. That was a bloody lie. China, India, Pakistan abstained, and North Korea voted against. Voted against nuclear weapons in favor of the motion. It was a yes. Okay? And the hardcore nuclear weapon states, United States, Britain, France, and Russia voted against. So the question we have to ask ourselves as Canadians, we're all against, we would have voted collectively in favor of that resolution. Okay? Our government voted against. And they voted against, that means they're in favor of nuclear war. And the reason they gave is that nuclear war was important, as an instrument of global security. And yet, that government in Pyongyang, which is vilified by the international media, voted in favor of the abolition of nuclear weapons. And, of course, that means the general abolition of nuclear weapons, because eventually those weapons are going to be used. And once they are used, it's the end of humanity. Fidel Castro said, in the case of a Third World War, in the case of the use of nuclear weapons, the collateral damage is humanity in its totality. Now, before proceeding with... I love the music. Yeah. Okay. Before proceeding with discussion more detailed discussion of North Korea, I'd like to situate a little bit the history of nuclear weapons from Hiroshima onwards. We've already discussed some elements of that, but it's very important that we understand that when the nuclear weapons project started in 1939. Now, that was the Manhattan Project. It was intended, officially this is what we're told, to counter Nazi Germany and of course the Japanese Empire. But recent declassified documents tell us exactly the opposite. On the 15th of September 1945, the United States released a secret document which consisted in bombing 66 major cities of the Soviet Union with 204 nuclear bombs. Now, that was less than a month after Hiroshima, 15th of September, at a time when the Soviet Union and the United States were allies. The project was released, it was a secret document in all the details, on September 15, 1945, but it had been under preparation as far back as 1942. And it was known to Moscow that, in fact, the United States was developing nuclear bombs, essentially to bomb the Soviet Union. And that occurred, as I said, that occurred in the course of World War II. Now, when you understand the logic of World War II and World War I and the Cold War, you might understand that, in effect, the Cold War was a continuation of World War II, and in fact, they had already identified the Soviet Union not as an ally, but as a target for a major nuclear intervention, which came before the launching of the Cold War, which was in 1947. So that they already had their bombs were there to blow up some 66 cities. The larger cities would have something like 6 nuclear bombs, and the smaller cities would be 1, 2, or 3. And this project was launched was finalized in 1945. And then Russia had information to the effect that this was ongoing, and they developed their own nuclear bomb, atomic bomb, in 1949. And that is when the whole issue of deterrence came in, of mutually assured destruction. Ultimately, the Truman administration was contemplating to use nuclear weapons against China, Russia, and North Korea Russia already, but they were contemplating bombing China shortly after the inauguration of the People's Republic of China, which is October 1949. Okay? In early 1950, they had plans to bomb China, and they had plans to bomb North Korea. Okay? Using nuclear weapons. So that, in effect, North Korea has been threatened with nuclear war for 67 years, since early 1950. China as well has been threatened for 67 years, and of course Russia has been threatened since 1945. And
Excuse me, how long has Canada been threatened by nuclear war?
I beg your pardon?
How long has Canada been threatened by nuclear war?
What are you referring to? You're saying that the Russians had similar plans, but the difference is that they didn't plan to bomb their ally. They developed, as of 1949, they had counter plans, yes, but by 1949, the Cold War started in 1947. The Soviets knew that of this plan to bomb the Soviet Union to smithereens. They knew about it at a much earlier stage, and yes, they did. They had. We don't know because those haven't. I don't have the documents on that. But I can tell you two things. That if the United States had not initiated this first strike doctrine of bombing countries which they don't like, when in fact they were allies, we would not have had a nuclear arms race. Okay? That is what is important. Now, you're absolutely right, Russia did. But Russia had it once formulated at a later stage, as of 1949. And they had a very large nuclear arsenal. We know that. And I'm certainly not apologizing for Russia in any way. I'm trying to give the history of nuclear war. Now, the history of nuclear war started in 1939. And the first plans to bomb the Soviet Union were formulated in 1942. And these documents are declassified. They've been declassified recently. Nobody's talking about them. Now, the other element is in the 1950s, there was a plan by the United States to bomb something of the order of 1,200 cities in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China. 1,200 cities. And that included many Western Europe, included many, even Berlin was targeted, okay? Because it was a divided city, but East Germany was targeted, Czech Republic, etc. Those documents have been declassified, so you can consult them. But what I want to signify is that there's a long-standing military agenda to use this weaponry, which precedes Hiroshima, and Japan was targeted, but in fact, the comprehensive plan with 66 cities and 204 bombs was intended for the Soviet Union. Now, we can interpret that in different ways, but my interpretation is that if this hadn't taken place, the world would be very different today. We wouldn't have had the nuclear arms race. And the nuclear arms race certainly incited the Russians to replicate these lists of cities, but they were operating within the context of mutually assured destruction. Now, mutually assured destruction was abandoned in 2001, and the irony is that you have, on the part of the United States, the notion that they can actually go in and win a nuclear war. Whether in fact, North Korea's won, but there's also plans. Well, this is the 1,200 cities. Just log down a little bit. You'll see they're listed there. That's a screenshot. But bear in mind that there's something diabolical because it's a global military agenda. Everybody in Canada buys made in China, okay? Now, why would you want to blow up China? I mean, if you blow up China, we'd be in a real mess here because there wouldn't be anything we could